Nothing prepares you for the moment when the ocean turns violent without warning. From the prank gone fatal when a great white made an appearance in 2025, to the near-deadly bull shark encounter beneath a Gulf oil rig, in this video we're telling 6 stories that reveal how fast a routine moment can spiral into chaos when powerful predators strike. On October 2, 2025, the air over Nauset Beach carried that cool early autumn sharpness that made the water look darker and rougher than it had only a month earlier. And Emma Callahan stepped into the surf with the same carefree confidence she always carried, because she believed the ocean was a place that rewarded boldness, even though she understood little about how quickly it could turn against someone who treated it like a stage for fun. Her friends watched from the sand with the relaxed amusement of people who expected nothing more than harmless entertainment, as they gathered for a weekend trip meant to celebrate a break from work and responsibility. Something Emma in particular had pushed for because she loved adding humor to everything she touched, especially when she could make others laugh at her own exaggerated stunts. She moved through the shallows with the familiar swagger of someone who liked to test limits, splashing as she went, her feet sinking into cold sand while the wind pushed small waves toward her legs in long rolling pulses that matched the incoming tide. She glanced back at her friends who were already preparing to film her latest prank. Emma had chosen the prank impulsively, deciding that she would pretend to struggle in the water to make her friends panic in that short, adrenaline-loaded moment before the punchline revealed itself. She thought it would be a perfect blend of danger and silliness, even though she never intended to go deeper than waist level. The beach was unusually quiet for that time of year, with only a handful of visitors scattered along the shore. The sea around her looked empty on the surface, concealing the cold, murky depths that stretched toward the nearby seal haulout, an area increasingly noted in early fall for attracting great white sharks following their seasonal feeding patterns along the outer cape. Emma began flailing her arms in exaggerated strokes, dipping beneath the water for brief moments before resurfacing with dramatic gasps, creating splashes that sent small ripples across the surface, and her friends burst into laughter because they recognized every element of her usual performance. They didn't notice how the tide was pushing her slightly farther than she planned, or how the water had darkened around her legs because the overcast sky filtered the light unevenly. And none of them considered how much commotion she was creating in an area where large predators were known to cruise just beyond the breakers. Beneath her feet, the sandy slope dropped sharply into deeper water, a natural boundary where seals often moved between resting areas and open sea, and Emma's frantic movements unknowingly mimicked the panicked thrashing of injured prey, carrying vibrations through the water with clarity that no human on the shore could perceive. A 14-foot great white shark patrolled the edge of that slope, moving with slow, deliberate sweeps of its tail as it followed scent trails and motion cues, guided by the biological precision that made it one of the most effective predators in the world. The shark was already near the seal routes used during the early autumn period when colder currents shifted prey distributions, and the sudden irregular splashing patterns reached it like an unmistakable beacon of opportunity. It angled upward from deeper water, rising through the dim greenish column with controlled acceleration, and its senses locked onto Emma's leg movements with the instinctive certainty that it was approaching a vulnerable animal struggling near the surface. Above, the water looked calm except for the disturbances Emma created, and her friends continued laughing, unaware that something massive had begun to charge toward her through the gloom. The strike came with devastating speed, shattering the lighthearted mood in an instant as the surface erupted in a violent surge of foam and water, and Emma vanished beneath the spray as the shark clamped onto her thigh with crushing force, its jaws engulfing a portion of her leg in a single decisive bite. The power of the attack wrenched her downward so abruptly that even her own reflexive gasp was swallowed by water before anyone realized what had happened, and her friends froze in a moment of disbelief that felt unreal because the ocean had transformed from playful setting to horror without warning. Screams broke across the beach as the water around the impact site churned with chaotic motion, a mixture of surf and blood that spread with alarming speed as the shark dragged her deeper toward the slope, where visibility collapsed into dark green shadows, making her movements impossible to track. Lifeguards stationed farther down the beach reacted immediately as they recognized the unmistakable signs of a shark attack. sprinting toward the water with rescue boards and signaling for bystanders to clear the shallows, while Emma's friends stood in paralyzed shock, trying to process the violence unfolding before them. When the shark released her after the initial bite, she briefly resurfaced in a swirl of foam, her body limp and severely injured, and the lifeguards pushed through chest-deep water to reach her before another strike could occur, forming a barrier with their boards as they pulled her back toward shore. The rescue was fast but frantic, and the severity of her wounds became unmistakable the moment they lifted her onto the sand, where blood soaked the incoming waves and her friends collapsed in anguish around her, powerless to stop what had already become irreversible. Medical teams rushed to stabilize her as sirens echoed from the parking lot above the dunes, but the bite had severed major arteries and muscle in a catastrophic pattern typical of a predatory great white strike. Despite desperate efforts to save her, the blood loss was too severe. By the time she was transported from the beach, the outcome had already been determined, and the shock settled across the community as word spread about how quickly the prank had turned into tragedy. Authorities later explained that recent seasonal shark movements, colder currents, and the proximity to the seal colony had created conditions where even shallow splashing could trigger a predatory response, and their assessment emphasized how small decisions in the water could lead to deadly misunderstandings in an ecosystem shaped by instinct and survival, leaving everyone who had witnessed the event struggling with the weight of what had happened in those few terrible moments. On August 14, 2017, the morning sky over New Smyrna Beach carried a heavy gray stillness that made the incoming surf feel restless and unpredictable. And Caleb Torres, a 32-year-old veteran lifeguard known for his calm under pressure, scanned the churning water with the trained eye of someone who understood how quickly routine conditions could turn dangerous. The beach had a reputation for strong rip currents and frequent shark encounters. Yet Caleb approached every shift with the steady confidence earned through years of rescues, because he believed that preparedness and speed could make the difference between survival and tragedy. The waves crashed hard against the sand in long, unbroken lines that revealed powerful currents beneath the surface, while wind gusts drove sprays of salt across the guard towers, setting the scene for a demanding day. Caleb noticed a teenage swimmer drifting farther from the designated safe zone, pulled seaward by a rip current that had formed along a trough only visible to trained observation, and he felt that familiar surge of alertness as he realized the teen was already struggling. The boy's arms flailed above the water in uneven strokes as the current sucked him outward with relentless force, and Caleb's instincts took over as he grabbed a rescue board, sprinted across the sand, and plunged into the surf with practiced efficiency. The water felt colder near the break line where the rip channeled toward the deeper ocean, and Caleb powered forward with strong kicks, pushing against the rushing pull beneath him while keeping his focus on the teenager whose panic grew with every passing second. The waves hammered Caleb's shoulders as he fought toward the boy, and when he reached him, he wrapped one arm around the teen's torso and positioned the rescue board beneath them with swift movements that came from muscle memory, trying to stabilize both of them before the current dragged them farther. The teen trembled as Caleb pulled him closer, and Caleb tightened his grip while beginning the long, diagonal swim that would guide them out of the rip's strongest pull, and then back toward shore. During the struggle with the board, Caleb scraped his leg against one of the handles, opening a shallow cut that he barely noticed, and the salt water stung the wound as the current continued tearing at them. Above the roar of the waves, lifeguards on shore shouted and signaled, preparing additional equipment in case the situation grew worse. Beneath the turbulent surface, the water deepened into a darker shade of blue-green where visibility diminished, and the sound of thrashing carried clearly through the dense medium, drawing the attention of a large predator patrolling the edge of the trough. A 13-foot tiger shark moved with deliberate, steady motions, following disturbances that suggested struggling prey, and the faint trace of blood dispersing in the current provided the final cue that directed it toward Caleb and the teen. Tiger sharks in late summer often roamed close to shore in Florida waters, following baitfish and environmental shifts, and the combination of erratic splashing and scent signals carried a powerful pull that required no hesitation from the animal. It rose upward through the murk with controlled force, angling toward the movement at the surface, Caleb kept pushing sideways across the rip, unaware of the shape rising beneath him, and every kick sent new splashes across the surface, amplifying the pattern that had already drawn the shark. When the attack came, it arrived with sudden, violent power as the tiger shark exploded from deeper water and clamped onto Caleb's thigh in a crushing, downward bite that sent a shockwave through his body and wrenched him off the rescue board. The force of the strike twisted him sideways, dragging both him and the teen underwater in a chaotic tangle of foam and limbs, as the shark shook its head with instinctive force meant to tear flesh free. Caleb held the teen with a desperate grip as the impact pulled them apart from the board, and the water around them erupted in a churning cloud that obscured everything. The teen kicked upward toward the surface as the shark drove Caleb deeper, and Caleb's survival instincts flared with a ferocity shaped by years of training, because protecting the swimmer mattered more to him than the pain tearing through his leg. He pushed upward with his free leg, punching and kicking at the shark's head as best he could, while trying to keep the boy within reach of the surface. But the predator twisted again, thrashing in a spiraling motion that drove Caleb farther from shore with terrifying speed. The water swirled with turbulence and blood as the shark's actions created powerful currents, and Caleb's efforts to fight back were hindered by the overwhelming force of each wrenching shake that radiated through his bones. On shore, lifeguards launched flotation devices and rescue poles, but the waves battered them relentlessly, knocking equipment sideways and making each attempt to reach Caleb nearly impossible. As the surf threw breakers across the shallow zone, the teen resurfaced gasping, and lifeguards sprinted into the water to pull him onto a board while calling out signals for immediate medical assistance, even as they scanned desperately for Caleb. When the shark finally released him after the initial attack, Caleb drifted upward to where rescuers managed to reach him, and they hauled him onto a longboard with urgent maneuvering, fighting through the pounding surf to bring him onto the sand, where medical kits were already being readied. The extent of his injuries became immediately evident as massive lacerations, deep muscle destruction, and shattered bone left him losing blood at a catastrophic rate that medics struggled to control while performing every procedure possible in the field environment. A circle of shocked beachgoers watched from a distance as lifeguards and paramedics worked frantically. But Caleb's pulse weakened rapidly, and despite every effort to stabilize him, he succumbed to his injuries within minutes of being brought ashore. The teenager survived with no physical injuries, though he trembled with shock as the reality of what had occurred settled onto the beach with a heavy, painful stillness. Authorities later reported that unusual shallow-water tiger shark activity, combined with powerful morning rip currents, had created conditions where the rescue attempt intersected with predator behavior in a rare but deadly convergence, leaving the lifeguard community mourning the loss of a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others in the very waters that claimed him. On September 7, 2024, the waters off Baja California lay beneath a wide, glowing moon that cast pale reflections across the surface, creating a shimmering field of silver that stretched toward the open Pacific. And marine biologist Sofia Reyes, a 34-year-old researcher known for her calm precision, prepared her nighttime sampling gear with the quiet focus that came from years spent studying elusive species that rarely approach shore during daylight hours. The research vessel drifted gently at the edge of a hammerhead aggregation zone, a location monitored for seasonal patterns linked to tidal cycles, lunar phases, and shifting prey migrations. Sophia always felt a sense of awe in these conditions because the ocean seemed both peaceful and unpredictable, in a way that reminded her how much remained unknown beneath the surface. The team worked by dim red lights to avoid disturbing the natural movements around them, and Sophia knelt on the rear platform to draw the first water sample, holding a heavy lamp used to illuminate the dark currents beneath the boat. The air felt warm despite the late hour, and a soft breeze carried the smell of salt and drifting plankton, while subtle ripples along the surface hinted at distant activity below. Over the past week, reports had noted unusual hammerhead movement patterns connected to stronger than normal lunar tides, pushing the animals closer to shore than expected. But Sophia believed their sampling location still fell within manageable risk, especially since scalloped hammerheads typically avoided direct contact with humans and preferred to remain in deeper, cooler water farther offshore. As she leaned forward to secure the sample container, the lamp slipped from her gloved hand in an instant of clumsiness that startled her more than she expected, and the metal fixture plummeted into the water with a loud splash that broke the calm surface and sent deep vibrations radiating through the surrounding area. The sudden disturbance disrupted the natural stillness of the zone, and Sophia froze on instinct because she recognized how unexpected noise and motion could trigger curiosity or investigative behavior in large predators nearby. The water churned slightly where the lamp had fallen, creating a brief glow as its beam flickered downward, illuminating drifting particles before fading into darkness. Unbeknownst to her, a 12-foot scalloped hammerhead had been gliding along the rocky seabed in a slow, deliberate patrol, following scent trails from prey stirred by the strong lunar tides, and the splash reached it with clarity that immediately drew its attention. The shark shifted upward, swimming with smooth, powerful strokes as its wide, distinctive head scanned for electrical signals and movement. And Sophia's presence near the platform created a clear target silhouette that contrasted sharply against the moonlit water. The boat rocked slightly as the tide strengthened beneath it, and Sophia steadied herself while preparing to retrieve another sampling tool, unaware that the predator was rising with increasing speed toward the source of the disturbance. The attack struck without hesitation, as the hammerhead surged from the dark water and collided with her left shoulder in a blunt, forceful impact that knocked her off balance and sent her tumbling into the sea with a flash of pain that radiated through her upper body. The shock of the cold water engulfed her in an instant, and she thrashed instinctively toward the surface as the shark clamped onto her arm and dragged her downward with violent, twisting motions that forced her against the rocky seabed below. The jagged stones tore at her wetsuit and skin as she struggled to push away from the powerful predator, and each movement sent new bursts of pain through her ribs as the shark's momentum scraped her across the rough terrain. Her colleagues shouted from above, their voices muffled by the water as they scrambled to locate her through the shifting currents, lowering poles and lines in frantic attempts to pull her upward. Sophia fought to break free from the hammerhead's grip, kicking at its body as it circled sharply and returned with another bite that raked across her torso, leaving long, deep lacerations that burned with cold and salt as she twisted away. The shark's movement stirred sediment clouds around them, obscuring her vision and making it impossible to track its exact position as it swept back and forth with unpredictable aggression driven by the sudden chaos in its environment. She forced herself upward through the heavy blur of suspended sediment, using the last of her strength to reach clearer water near the surface, and the boat's lights appeared in hazy beams that shimmered above her as her colleagues extended their arms and equipment down toward her. The pain in her chest sharpened with every stroke as fractured ribs pressed inward with each breath, and she fought to maintain consciousness while the water around her darkened with spreading blood. When her colleagues finally reached her, they hauled her onto the platform with urgent coordination, securing her against the metal surface while the boat rocked under the growing lunar tide. Medics aboard the vessel acted quickly, applying pressure to her wounds and stabilizing her breathing with practiced efficiency. The extent of the damage became clear as blood pooled beneath her, and her torso revealed wide, tearing injuries consistent with repeated hammerhead strikes. Her pulse weakened and her vision dimmed, but the immediate intervention prevented further deterioration as the boat sped toward the nearest harbor, cutting through the dark water with a sense of haste that matched the severity of her condition. Authorities later analyzed the incident and noted that intense lunar tides, combined with altered prey distribution, had pushed hammerheads to unusually shallow depths, creating an environment where even experienced scientists could encounter unpredictable predator behavior, despite following standard precautions. The rare attack left Sophia physically scarred and emotionally shaken, reminding her and the scientific community that even the most informed understanding of ocean predators could not eliminate the inherent risks of working in changing marine ecosystems, reshaped by shifting environmental forces. On March 22, 2020, the waters near Grand Turk rolled beneath a restless sky that sent sporadic gusts across the open sea. And adventure guide Isabella Cruz, a 40-year-old sailor with decades of experience navigating unpredictable currents, moved across the deck of the small charter vessel with the steady balance of someone who understood how quickly shifting wind could turn a routine excursion into something more demanding. The boat cut through choppy waves that rose in uneven swells, pushing against the hull in rhythmic slaps that hinted at the unsettled conditions offshore that day. And Isabella kept adjusting the sails to maintain their course while tourists rested inside the cabin, unaware of the tension building in the air. She'd always trusted her instincts at sea, believing that preparation and composure allowed her to manage whatever surprises the water delivered. As the wind strengthened, the mainsail pulled harder than expected, and Isabella stepped toward the mast to readjust the line before it strained too tightly. The deck tilted beneath her feet as a sudden wave lifted the stern, and she reached out to steady herself. But the wet surface created a thin layer of slick salt water that turned her firm footing into a dangerous slip. In one swift, uncontrolled moment, she lost her balance and toppled over the rail, plunging into the swirling ocean as the boat rocked sharply above her. The impact stunned her briefly, and she surfaced with a gasp as spray filled her nose and eyes while the vessel drifted several meters ahead before the crew realized she had gone overboard. The fall scraped her elbows and shins against the metal edge of the rail, leaving shallow but bleeding cuts that she barely registered through the cold shock spreading through her limbs, and she kicked to stay afloat while calling out to the deckhands who were already rushing toward the stern. The choppy surface made visibility uneven, and every rise and dip of the waves broke her line of sight with the boat as it circled back in a slow arc that felt much longer than it truly was. Beneath the surface, faint trails of diluted blood drifted through the water in thin, wavering ribbons that spread outward with the current. A solitary oceanic white-tip shark patrolled the deeper blue not far from the drifting vessel, following scent trails and erratic disturbances created by prey migration patterns that had moved unusually close to the island that day. The species was known for bold, curious behavior, especially around objects or creatures that appeared vulnerable at the surface. The combination of splashing and blood drew the shark upward with purposeful movements. Its broad pectoral fins angled slightly downward as it rose, and its silhouette emerged beneath the pale turquoise surface, gliding toward Isabella with increasing speed. She treaded water as best she could, trying to keep her head above each swell while waiting for the boat to come close enough for rescue, unaware of the shape closing the distance below her. The first strike came with a violent, ripping force as the shark lunged from beneath and clamped onto her thigh in a powerful bite that tore through muscle and sent agonizing pain radiating upward into her torso. The water erupted around her in a rush of foam as she screamed beneath the noise of the wind, and she instinctively thrashed her arms to push herself away from the predator. But the shark's sudden aggression left her disoriented and struggling for breath. She tried to swim toward the boat, but the shark circled back with swift precision and surged upward again, biting into her left shoulder with crushing pressure that forced her underwater in a twisting motion that triggered a primal panic unlike anything she had ever felt. The predator shook her briefly before releasing its grip, and she spiraled through the water, disoriented as the salt stung her wounds and the pain radiated through her bones. She kicked frantically to reach the surface and broke through with a loud gasp, coughing as waves rolled over her face and dark red clouds billowed around her from the deep gashes along her leg and shoulder. The crew on deck shouted signals to one another as they fought the swells to keep the boat steady while throwing paddles, lines, and flotation devices in an attempt to deter the shark. Each object splashed hard against the water as they aimed to create enough disturbance to push the predator away from Isabella. But the clouded water made it nearly impossible to track the shark's movements beneath her as it swept in and out of view, circling with calculated intent. Isabella forced herself to strike out with her fists each time she felt a rush of motion near her legs, trying to appear large and unpredictable despite the numbing weakness spreading through her limbs from blood loss and shock. The shark returned with another strike that grazed her side, scraping teeth across her ribs and sending a burst of agony through her already weakened body as it tried to drag her sideways again. But a large paddle thrown from the deck splashed against the shark's snout with enough force to interrupt its advance. The predator veered off momentarily, confused by the sudden burst of stimuli, and the crew seized the brief opening to maneuver the boat closer, extending a long flotation pole that reached toward her as she fought to stay conscious. She grasped the pole with trembling hands, and the crew hauled her toward the rail with a coordinated effort that brought her aboard in a desperate, dragging motion as waves slammed against the hull. Once on deck, Isabella lay soaked and shivering violently, her skin pale beneath streaks of blood that flowed from deep lacerations, revealing torn muscle and fractured bones beneath her shredded wetsuit. The cold wind amplified the rapid drop in her body temperature, pushing her toward hypothermia as the crew wrapped her in blankets and applied pressure to her wounds with whatever first aid materials they could reach. Her breaths came in shallow, uneven gasps as she tried to maintain consciousness while the boat sped back toward shore, cutting through the rough water with urgent determination. Authorities later noted that prey migration patterns had pushed oceanic white-tip sharks unusually close to the island that day, creating conditions where even an experienced guide like Isabella found herself in a sudden and violent confrontation with a predator rarely aggressive toward humans. The incident turned a routine sailing trip into a harrowing fight for survival, leaving her physically broken but alive, carried back to shore by colleagues who refused to give up as the sea churned restlessly around them. On May 14, 2021, a dense blanket of fog drifted over the waters off Gansby, softening the early light into a pale haze that blurred the horizon and created the eerie stillness that often settled over the channel known as Shark Alley. And wildlife photographer Marius Van Zyl, a 38-year-old specialist in documenting marine predators, prepared his camera gear on the deck of a small research vessel as he braced himself for the cold wind sweeping across the surface. The sea rolled in slow, heavy swells that made the boat rise and fall with a steady rhythm, and the muffled sounds of distant breakers added to the quiet tension of a morning that carried an unsettling energy, even before anyone aboard realized how unusual the shark activity would become. Marius had spent years filming great whites in various parts of South Africa, and he prided himself on understanding the patterns and behaviors of the massive predators that dominated these waters, especially during the seasons when seal activity peaked along the rocky islands nearby. The fog, while frustrating for visibility, also provided atmospheric conditions that he believed might help him capture rare footage of breaching sharks if the animals approached close enough to the vessel. He adjusted his lens repeatedly, wiping beads of moisture from the glass as the cold air condensed against its surface, and he kept glancing over the rail each time a dark shape passed beneath the water, because the sharks seemed unusually shallow that morning. The crew had already noted the disturbance of a fresh seal kill drifting several meters from the boat, its scent and movement drawing several large great whites to the area with an intensity that surprised even the seasoned researchers. The animals circled closer and closer to the vessel, their dorsal fins cutting through the fog like dark blades, and each slow pass sent ripples that tapped lightly against the hull. Marius felt both excitement and caution, because the proximity of multiple large sharks so close to the surface was rare even in Shark Alley, and he knew the combination of feeding behavior and reduced visibility could create unpredictable moments. He leaned over the rail with deliberate care, bracing his upper body as he aimed his camera downward to capture a close-up shot of a massive shark gliding beneath the surface, its pale belly flickering in the dim light as it circled the drifting seal remains. The cold air stung his face, and the wet metal railing chilled his hands while he adjusted his focus, determined to frame a perfect shot of the animal before it disappeared into the fog-thickened distance. The swell rocked the boat at a slight angle, but he compensated by shifting his weight and tightening his grip, unaware that below him, one of the largest sharks in the group was beginning a rapid ascent, triggered by the competitive frenzy around the kill. Without warning, a 16-foot great white burst upward in a violent explosion of power that shattered the surface directly beside the boat, its massive head smashing into the hull with a heavy thud that jolted everyone on deck. The impact rattled the vessel hard enough to knock Marius off balance, and his camera slipped from his hands as his body pitched forward over the rail, sending him plunging into the icy, churning water before he had time to react. The shock of the cold crushed the air from his lungs, and he flailed instinctively as the fog swallowed him from the crew's view for a brief, disorienting moment. The great white lunged toward him almost immediately, drawn by the splashing and the scent of the seal kill that had already heightened its aggressive focus. Before Marius could regain control of his movements, the shark clamped its jaws around his torso with crushing strength, tearing through muscle and bone as it twisted violently and dragged him downward in a spiral that filled his senses with pain, pressure, and darkness. The water closed over them as the predator pulled him beneath the waves, and the world narrowed to a chaotic blend of bubbles, blood, and the relentless force of the shark's shaking movements. The crew rushed to the stern, grabbing poles and containers of chum to distract the animal. But the water was chaotic and nearly opaque as blood dispersed through the swirling currents, making it difficult to track the shark or Marius in the fog-thickened sea. They struck the water repeatedly with long poles in an attempt to interrupt the predator's grip, and the noise sent dull vibrations across the surface that momentarily disrupted the shark's movement enough for Marius's body to drift upward as the predator released him to reposition. The crew lunged forward, extending hooks and flotation devices as they fought to pull him within reach. But each attempt was slowed by the rising and falling swells that slammed against the hull, making balance difficult and visibility nearly non-existent. When they finally managed to secure his arm and haul him toward the rail, they moved with frantic coordination, pulling him aboard in a desperate dragging motion that left streaks of blood across the deck as they laid him flat on the cold surface. His injuries were catastrophic, with deep tearing wounds across his torso exposing shattered ribs and shredded muscle, and his skin was pale beneath the rapid spread of blood pooling beneath him. The crew applied pressure with shaking hands while signaling for immediate assistance, but the severity of the damage and the massive blood loss left little time for meaningful intervention. The boat turned toward shore with urgent speed, cutting through the heavy fog as the swells battered the bow, and the crew continued attempting to stabilize him despite the growing recognition that his condition was beyond recovery. His breathing weakened with each passing minute, and his pulse faded as the cold air settled over the deck in a thick, quiet heaviness that mirrored the gravity of the attack they had witnessed. Authorities later confirmed that unusual seal activity that morning had drawn multiple great whites unnaturally close to the boat, creating an environment where even experienced wildlife professionals faced extreme risk. What should have been a routine filming session transformed into a deadly encounter, shaped by a convergence of fog, feeding behavior, and proximity, reminding everyone involved how quickly Shark Alley could shift from extraordinary to lethal. On August 18, 2025, the Gulf of Mexico lay under a heavy layer of gray clouds drifting in long, uneven shapes, casting a muted light over the remote oil rig where Derek Lawson prepared for what he assumed would be a routine post-storm inspection. Yet the air still carried the sharp scent of churned seawater and the low metallic hum of machinery that never stopped its restless vibration deep within the steel structure. Derek, a 29-year-old engineer who had spent years learning the unpredictable rhythms of offshore work, moved with practiced precision as he checked his equipment, steadying himself against the rail while wind gusts brushed past him and waves slapped against the rig legs far below, reminding him that the storm from the night before had stirred the sea into a restless mess of sediment and shifting currents. He knew the dive would be difficult because visibility after heavy weather often dropped to almost nothing, forcing divers to feel their way through water thick with suspended sand and debris. But he also understood that the pipeline inspection had to be completed quickly so operations could resume, and the responsibility pressed against him with a weight he had grown used to carrying. Derek lowered himself into the water, feeling the sudden drop in temperature as he descended beside the massive supports of the platform. He followed the guide rope downward while his flashlight cut only a narrow beam through the murk, revealing clouds of disturbed particles swirling around him like drifting smoke. Below the surface, the vibrations from the drilling equipment pulsed through the water in slow, rhythmic waves that spread outward across the seabed, drawing schools of baitfish into disorganized clusters that darted back and forth in nervous bursts of movement as if unable to decide which direction offered safety. And Derek knew this type of activity often attracted larger predators, even though he had rarely encountered anything more threatening than curious barracuda or the occasional reef shark. Still, he kept his movement steady as he approached the section of pipeline that needed inspection, running his hand along the metal surface while the noise from the rig echoed faintly through the water, and the seafloor currents pushed warm and cold pockets around him in unpredictable swirls. He did not see the bull shark at first because the water around him was nearly opaque, but the animal had been circling just beyond his field of vision, drawn toward the vibrations, the wounded baitfish, and the confusion created by the recent storm. Its heavy muscular body moved with the confidence of a predator perfectly adapted to murky waters, where vision mattered far less than the ability to detect movement and the faint electrical signals pulsing from anything alive. Derek felt a sudden pressure wave shift behind him, followed by a sense of displacement that made him turn instinctively. And in that same moment, the 10-foot bull shark exploded from the gloom with astonishing speed, slamming into his thigh with such violent force that it knocked him sideways into the steel supports of the rig, sending pain shooting through his leg as his body ricocheted against the metal frame. The shark's teeth grazed through his wetsuit and into muscle, tearing fabric and skin while leaving a deep furrow along his thigh. And Derek felt the burn of the wound spread in a hot pulse that mixed with the cold shock of the surrounding water as he tried to push himself away from the supports. But the sediment storm made it impossible to see more than a few inches in front of him. He kicked downward and outward in wide, frantic arcs, trying to create distance, though each movement sent fresh flashes of pain through his leg and stirred the water even more, creating vibrations that only intensified the shark's interest. The bull shark spun back toward him in a tight arc, bumping his side and nipping again as it responded to the movement and the faint trace of blood drifting through the water. And Derek felt the pressure of its snout and the scrape of teeth before he managed a desperate burst upward toward the guide rope. Above him, his coworkers had already sensed something was wrong when his tether line jerked violently. They tossed flotation devices from the deck and shouted instructions that barely reached him through the muffled distortion of the water. Their presence gave him a fixed point to orient toward, even as panic threatened to break through the thin barrier of his focus. Derek pulled himself upward, hand over hand, while the swirling sediment turned every direction into a shifting brown cloud that hid both safety and danger. He fought the instinct to look behind him, knowing he needed every ounce of strength to ascend the last few meters. The shark brushed past him once more as it circled, responding to the water turbulence and the fading blood trail. But the noise from the rig, combined with the frantic movement near the surface, pulled the predator away just long enough for Derek to reach the ladder where two workers extended a pole toward him, guiding his hands until he felt the cold metal under his fingers. He hauled himself upward with the last of his adrenaline, dragging his injured leg behind him, while the wound pulsed and seawater streamed off his suit in long rivulets. And when he finally reached the deck, he collapsed against the rail as the wind met his face with a cool, trembling relief that made the entire ordeal feel both surreal and terrifyingly real. His thigh carried a deep laceration carved through muscle, the surrounding skin already swelling from the impact of the initial strike, and bruises spread rapidly across his quadriceps where the shark had slammed into him with the blunt force characteristic of bull sharks that relied on impact as much as bite during surprise attacks. Derek lay on the deck surrounded by his coworkers, who moved quickly to stop the bleeding and stabilize his leg while the sea rolled beneath them with an indifferent rhythm. He felt the enormity of what had happened settle slowly into his mind, leaving him shaken but grateful to be alive after a near-fatal encounter in a place he had always considered dangerous but manageable, never truly expecting to come face to face with one of the ocean's most unpredictable predators.